Shadow from beyond the stars. The night was moonless. Darkness enveloped the city like a predatory animal, ready to swallow it whole, along with all its inhabitants. The tall buildings appeared deserted. Even the streetlights seemed powerless against the thick gloom. But this night was unlike any other. It brought something that would change everything forever. The first disappearance occurred on the outskirts. A young man named Tom was returning home after his evening shift. He heard something moving in the darkness. A soft rustling, a strange sound resembling metal scraping. Turning around, he saw a figure, a tall, thin shape with long limbs resembling tentacles. Its eyes glowed with a blue light. Tom didn't even have time to scream. Something grabbed him, and he vanished into the darkness. The next day, people began talking about the disappearances. The police conducted a search but found nothing except scratches on the asphalt and pieces of strange gray substance. It smelled like burnt metal. And at night, the disappearances continued. A woman who worked at the supermarket went out for a smoke break and never returned. The cameras recorded only a moment. Her figure blurred in the air as if sucked into another dimension. Then, a man in the park. He was sitting on a bench, and suddenly a shadow appeared behind him. The cameras captured only a flash of blue light, after which the man simply vanished. Soon, panic spread throughout the city. People locked themselves in their homes, and the streets were filled with silence and fear. But even walls couldn't protect them. Some claimed to have seen tall beings gliding through the streets like ghosts. They didn't just kill. They abducted people. Jack and Sarah, a married couple living in the suburbs, were among the first to realize this was no ordinary disappearance. They noticed strange symbols on the walls of buildings. They seemed to be burned into them by a laser. These were spirals resembling an eye. One night, Jack heard a rustling by the door. He peeked through the peephole and his heart froze. There stood a tall creature, its eyes shining with a blue light. It had no lips, just a dark slit for a mouth. Long arms reached for the door. Jack jumped to his feet, grabbed a kitchen knife, and held his breath. But the door didn't open. Instead, a strange sound came through the ventilation hole, like something crawling inside. Suddenly, Sarah screamed. A tentacle had slipped under the door and grabbed her by the leg. Jack desperately tried to pull his wife back, but the creature was stronger. In an instant, Sarah vanished, and only her scream remained in the room. Jack ran. He ran through the night, through the darkness, until he reached the main highway. And there he saw it. In the sky, something enormous hung, like a black dome that blocked out the stars. It was covered in glowing symbols that changed every second. The ground shook as hundreds of figures began descending from under the dome. They didn't walk, they glided above the ground. Their long bodies didn't touch the asphalt, and their eyes shone in the darkness. The slaughter began. People ran out of their houses, but there was nowhere to escape. The creatures destroyed everything in their path. They released blue lightning from their bodies, turning people to ash. Some screamed, some begged for help, but it was in vain. Jack understood. This was not just an invasion. This was the end. Those who weren't killed disappeared into the air. They were pulled into dark beams stretching toward the black dome. He ran to the forest and hid between the trees. He was breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. But then he realized something terrible. He was no longer human. His hands trembled, but not from fear. They were growing longer, his skin taking on a grayish tint. He could see everything more clearly, as if his eyes were adjusting to a different spectrum of light. Jack opened his mouth to scream, but what came out was not a scream, but a strange raspy sound. He was no longer himself. The earth fell. The aliens had won. And those who survived were no longer human. Jack felt his body changing. His bones creaked as if they were transforming into something new, something otherworldly. He no longer controlled his hands. They began to stretch, his fingers sharpened, and his skin took on a strange metallic sheen. A whisper echoed in his mind, foreign, otherworldly, forcing him to think thoughts that were not his own. He collapsed to his knees in the dark forest, and above him hung the black sky, pierced by the light of ships. His heart raced faster, but he knew this was no longer a human heart. It beat to a different rhythm, obeying the commands of those who came from beyond the stars. They're turning us. He whispered hoarsely, but his voice sounded alien, changed, as if it came from another world. Behind him, a rustle sounded. Jack turned. Other figures appeared between the trees. Former humans. They stood in the darkness, their eyes glowing with the same blue light. He understood. They were waiting. In the distance, a cry echoed. There were still some left who hadn't yet changed, who were still human. Jack felt something in his mind commanding him to go toward these voices, to find those who hadn't yet become part of this new world. His legs moved forward on their own. He was no longer human. But part of him still remembered who he had been. No. He tried to stop, but his legs moved forward. He no longer had control. Ahead, between the trees, Jack saw a small group of people. They were hiding between the roots of an old oak tree, huddled together. A woman, clutching a child in her arms, was crying, covering the child's mouth to keep it from making a sound. Jack approached. The other shadows moved with him. The woman raised her head, her eyes meeting his gaze. "Jack?" She whispered, full of hope. His name. It sounded as though it belonged to someone else. Jack took a step forward, feeling his body yearning to obey the command, feeling his hands reach out to grab these people, to transform them, to make them part of this new world. But something inside him still resisted. He stopped. All the other shadows stood still. They waited for him to make his choice. Jack trembled. His memories were slipping away, like smudged paint on a canvas. His name. Did it still matter? He didn't want to do this. He had to. But he didn't want to. His body was being torn apart by two opposing forces. The command of the aliens and the remnants of his humanity still flickering within him. Suddenly, something flared up in his mind. Pain. Noise. The black ship hovering above them began to change. Its light grew dimmer, and the symbols on its surface began to flicker. Something was wrong. And then Jack understood. These creatures could transform people. But if someone resisted, if someone refused to obey, the system broke down. He felt himself tearing apart from within. He could change everything. He took a final step back. And then the ship above him shuddered as if something inside it was tearing apart. The aliens screamed. The light in their eyes faded. The black dome in the sky began to dissolve, its material seeming to burn itself out, breaking apart into fragments. In that moment, Jack realized. He was returning. His hands became human again, his heart beat in the rhythm familiar to him from childhood. He could hear the wind rushing through the trees. He could still hear a distant cry, but now it was the cry of defeat. He turned his head and saw that the woman and child were still there. She was staring at him with wide, open eyes. "You've come back," she whispered. Jack took a step forward and fell to his knees. He was alive. He had won. And over the city, where just an hour ago the black dome had hung, the stars reappeared. Jack breathed heavily, feeling his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He didn't understand what had just happened. Why had the ship started to break apart? Why had he returned to his body, while the others remained under the control of those creatures? The woman cautiously took a step toward him, holding the child in her arms. She was still unsure whether the person standing before her was truly human, or just another trick from those who came from beyond the stars. How did you do it?" she whispered. Jack shook his head. "I don't know." His voice sounded hoarse, as if his throat hadn't recovered from everything they had done to him. "But I saw their consciousness. Their network. They're all connected. All of them like one." He looked up at the sky, where just moments ago the black shadow of the ship had hung. But now, there was nothing but the night stars. "I broke their system," he muttered, surprised by his own words. The woman pressed the child tighter to her chest. "You're saying they're dead?" Jack shook his head again. No. But they lost control. They can't see us anymore. He heard movement behind him. He turned around and saw several people hiding between the trees. They were terrified, hungry, exhausted, but alive. Some of them held weapons, knives, sticks, even an old rifle. Is it true? Asked one of them, a middle-aged man with a thick beard. They're gone? Jack struggled to get to his feet. They could come back. But right now, they're weakened. What should we do? The woman looked confused. Jack paused. He knew this wasn't over. Those creatures hadn't just invaded Earth. They wanted something more. They wanted to conquer humanity, turn everyone into beings like them, make us part of their consciousness. And now, with their connections severed, they would either retreat or find another way to regain control. We need to find others, Jack said at last. If there are still any humans left, we have to gather them together. You want to start a war? The bearded man asked skeptically. Jack grimly smiled. I think the war has already begun. The next few hours were spent scouring the ruins of the city. An eerie silence hung everywhere. The streets were filled with abandoned cars. Houses stood empty, many of them burned or shattered. They found a few more people. Worn out, frightened, but ready to fight. And then, just when it seemed like the danger had passed, they heard a sound. A low hum. The sky darkened once again. Jack looked up and saw another ship slowly emerging from behind the clouds. It was larger than the previous one. Its hull shimmered with blue light and long cable-like tendrils, as if alive, hung down from it, writhing in the air. They've come back. Someone whispered behind him. Jack clenched his fists. He felt the same whisper in his head again. They were trying to take over his mind once more. But this time he was ready. Get ready, he said, turning to the others. This isn't over. But now they know we can resist. The fight for Earth was just beginning. The sky darkened again, and fear returned. The massive ship hovered over the city, its contours shifting as if it were alive. Jack felt a cold tremor pass through his body. They had come back. But this time, he was not alone. The people around him gripped whatever they could as weapons. They were no longer just surviving. They were ready to fight. They know we can resist, Jack whispered, feeling the foreign whisper try to break into his mind again. But now he understood how to fight it. He took a step forward and felt something invisible stir within him again, something that remained after his contact with these creatures. But this time he took control. And then he saw them. From the ship, new figures slowly descended. Taller, stronger, with bodies radiating blue light. They walked, not touching the ground, like godlike shadows. Jack didn't wait for them to strike first. He felt his hands beginning to change again. But this time, he didn't resist it. He embraced the power that remained within him after the transformation. His eyes flashed with the same blue light, and he felt the dark alien network piercing his consciousness. He saw their minds. He saw their fears. They were afraid of losing control. He smiled. You want a war? He whispered. Then take it. Jack raised his hand, and in that instant, the ship above them trembled. He was no longer human, but he wasn't one of them either. He had become something new. The aliens froze. They couldn't move. The people behind Jack saw this and understood. He had them trapped. Fire! Someone shouted. The ground shook with explosions. The people rushed forward, attacking the creatures with everything they had. Bullets pierced their translucent skin. Blades cut through the darkness. The aliens screamed, their bodies convulsed, and the ship above them began to flicker out. Jack felt his body pulse with energy. He directed this force against the ship, and it began to fall apart. This is your end, he whispered. And then it was over. The ship exploded into pieces. The aliens froze, their eyes dimmed, and they fell to the ground, dead. Silence followed. Jack breathed heavily, feeling his body return to its human form. The people around him cried out, shouting with joy. They had won. He looked up and gazed at the sky. The stars were shining again. The earth was free. They had survived. But now they knew, in the darkness, somewhere among the stars, there were those who could still return. But if they come back, Jack and everyone left would be ready.